Unhand her, you brute! This is not a fair! You are safe now. This isn't over. Unhand her, you brute! This is not a fair! You are safe now. This isn't over.
3 years of beatings and abuse until a duke walked through the door. Emotional Victorian tale. The needle slipped through the silk, leaving a trail of crimson behind it. Elspeth Thorne stared at her hands in the dim candlelight, watching blood from her split knuckles stain the dove-grey fabric of her husband's evening coat. She should stop, should bind her fingers first, but Thomas would be home within the hour and the coat needed mending before then. Everything needed to be perfect before then. Outside Blackwood Hall, November rain lashed against the windows with the fury of a Georgian storm. Inside, the manor sat in its usual oppressive silence, cold stone walls that trapped heat in summer and cold in winter, servants who'd learned to move like ghosts, and Elspeth herself, nearly invisible in the shadows of what had once been her home. 3 years. 1,095 nights, if she counted correctly. 1,095 times she'd prepared herself for Thomas Blackwood's return from the gentlemen's clubs of Bath, never knowing if he'd be merely drunk or violent with it. Tonight, based on the urgent message from his man of business, would likely be the latter. The needle slipped again, this time piercing her thumb. Elspeth didn't flinch. Pain had become so commonplace these past 3 years that she barely registered it anymore. Just another thread in the tapestry of her existence under the coverture laws of 1775 England, laws that had made her legal identity vanish the moment she'd spoken her wedding vows. Mrs. Thomas Blackwood. No longer Elspeth Thorne. No longer a person in the eyes of the law, merely an extension of her husband's will. The door knocker sounded, heavy iron striking iron with an authority that made Elspeth's hands still. That wasn't Thomas. He never knocked at his own door, would burst through already shouting demands and accusations. This was someone else. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive. Elspeth heard Hobbs, their elderly butler, shuffle to the door. Heard the creak of hinges, then a voice that made her blood run cold and hot simultaneously. I'm here to see Mrs. Blackwood. She knew that voice. Would have known it anywhere, despite 3 years of silence. Deep, cultured, carrying the unconscious authority of a man born to command. Sebastian Ashford. The Duke of Aristhorpe. The man she'd been engaged to before her father's debts had destroyed everything. Elspeth stood so quickly the sewing scattered across the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she heard Hobbs's stammering response, something about the master not being home, about propriety, about how the mistress wasn't receiving visitors. I didn't ask if she was receiving. Sebastian's voice cut through the butler's protests like a blade through silk. I said I'm here to see her. You will show me to her, or you will stand aside while I find her myself. It was the voice of a duke invoking aristocratic immunity, the right of the nobility to bypass social conventions when necessary. Hobbs would have no choice but to comply. Elspeth's mind raced. She couldn't let Sebastian see her like this. Her dress was 3 years old, mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Her hair, once her pride, hung in a simple bun because Thomas had forbidden her from spending money on a lady's maid. And her hands. She looked down at her blooded fingers, at the bruises blooming purple-black across her wrists where Thomas had grabbed her this morning. At the fading yellow marks on her forearms from last week's rage. She couldn't hide this. Sebastian would see everything. The drawing room door opened, and there he was. 3 years had changed Sebastian Ashford, but not in ways that dimmed his presence. If anything, he'd grown more imposing, broader in the shoulders, his face more angular, with lines around his eyes that suggested either laughter or sorrow. His powdered hair was styled simply, without the elaborate curls fashionable men wore. His velvet frock coat was deep midnight blue, perfectly tailored, and he carried a silver-headed cane that Elspeth knew was more symbol of status than necessity. He looked every inch the Duke. And Elspeth felt every inch the broken thing she'd become. Sebastian's eyes swept the room, cataloguing everything in a single glance. The cold hearth, Thomas refused to waste coal on rooms he wasn't using. The threadbare furniture, he'd sold the good pieces to pay gambling debts. The single candle, because even candlelight had become a luxury. Then his gaze found Elspeth, and something in his expression cracked. "Dear God," he breathed. Elspeth lifted her chin, summoning the pride that was all she had left. "Your Grace. This is unexpected. Is it?" Sebastian moved toward her with controlled urgency, his cane tapping against the floorboards. "Did you think I wouldn't hear? That news of Thomas Blackwood's brutality wouldn't reach London? I don't know what you've heard. Your hands." He was close enough now that she could smell him, sandalwood and leather and something else, something that reminded her of the girl she'd been before coverture had erased her. "Show me your hands, Elspeth." It wasn't a request. Elspeth found herself extending her trembling fingers, watching as Sebastian took them with a gentleness that made her want to weep. He said nothing as he examined the split knuckles, the bloodstains, the bruises. But his jaw tightened with each discovery, a muscle jumping in his cheek that suggested barely contained fury. "How long?" His voice was dangerously soft. "Does it matter?" Elspeth tried to pull her hands back, but Sebastian held firm. 3 years. Your Grace. Sebastian. His eyes met hers, grey as winter storms. "You were Elspeth to me once. Before your father's debts forced you to marry a man neither of us knew was a monster. Before the law made you disappear into his name and his control." His thumb traced one of her bruises with heartbreaking gentleness. "And I am still Sebastian to you. Always." Elspeth felt tears burning her eyes. She'd trained herself not to cry years ago, tears only made Thomas angrier, but Sebastian's tenderness was undoing her carefully constructed walls. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If Thomas finds you, then he'll answer for what he's done." Sebastian released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, producing a folded document. "I know everything, Elspeth. About the gambling, the debts, the entailed land he's been illegally mortgaging. About his treatment of you." "How?" "Because I've spent 3 years searching for a way to undo what your father's desperation wrought." Sebastian's expression was fierce, protective. 3 years buying back every acre Thomas gambled away, every debt he incurred, every marker he signed. "I didn't come for the land, Elspeth. I came for the lady of the manor." Before Elspeth could respond, the front door crashed open with violence that made them both turn. Thomas Blackwood stood in the doorway, soaking wet from the rain, his face flushed with drink and rage. "Get out of my house," he snarled at Sebastian. "You have no right." "I have every right." Sebastian moved to place himself between Thomas and Elspeth, his whole body radiating dangerous calm. "By the authority vested in me by His Majesty, I am here to investigate reports of violence against a lady under the protection of the Crown. She's my wife." Thomas lurched forward, and Elspeth could smell the gin on him from across the room. "The law gives me the right to discipline. The law gives you no right to brutality." Sebastian's voice cracked like a whip. "You have violated the King's peace, and I am the King's shadow in this county. Your actions end tonight." The confrontation hung in the air, weighted with 3 years of suffering and rage. And Elspeth, standing behind the Duke who'd come to save her, felt something she hadn't felt in 1095 nights. Hope. 2. The library at Blackwood Hall had once been Elspeth's sanctuary. Now it was just another room where she felt Thomas's presence like a shadow, where the walls seemed to close in with the weight of coverture laws that had made her nothing more than her husband's property. But tonight, with Sebastian standing between her and Thomas, the library felt different. Larger. As though the Duke's presence had somehow expanded the very walls. "You're drunk, Blackwood." Sebastian's voice was controlled, aristocratic courtesy masking steel underneath. "Go sleep it off. We'll discuss this in the morning when you're capable of rational conversation." "Discuss what?" Thomas swayed slightly, his hand on the doorframe for balance. "That bastard's trying to steal my wife. Your wife, Sebastian said quietly, has bruises that suggest you view her as something significantly less valuable than property. Property, at least, a man takes care of. Elspeth watched the exchange with her heart in her throat. She'd learned over 3 years to read Thomas's moods, to see the signs before his rage exploded. And right now, with his face flushing darker and his fists clenching, she knew what was coming. Thomas, please, she started, her voice trained to soothe even when she wanted to scream. His Grace is right. You're tired. Let's discuss this. Shut your mouth, woman. Thomas's eyes fixed on her with the cold hatred she'd learned to expect. This is your fault. You brought him here. Probably sent him letters, begging for rescue like the pathetic creature you are. I did no such thing. I said shut up. Thomas lunged toward her, and Elspeth braced for impact. It never came. Sebastian's cane cracked across Thomas's shins with precise, controlled force. Not enough to break bone, but enough to send him sprawling. Before Thomas could recover, Sebastian had him by the collar, hauling him upright with surprising strength. Touch her again, Sebastian said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and deadly, and you will answer to me in a way that makes your gambling debts look trivial. Do you understand? For the first time in 3 years, Elspeth saw fear in Thomas's eyes. You can't threaten me, Thomas blustered, but his voice shook. I'm a gentleman, same as you. You're nothing like me. Sebastian released him with a shove that sent Thomas stumbling backward. A gentleman protects those weaker than himself. A gentleman honors his vows. You are neither gentle nor a man. You're a coward who beats his wife and gambles away land you don't legally own. Thomas's face went white. What are you talking about? The entailment. Sebastian's smile was sharp as a blade. Blackwood Hall and its surrounding lands are entailed property, meant to pass to your heir intact. But you've been mortgaging it piece by piece, illegally, to cover your gambling debts. That's a crime, Blackwood. One that carries severe penalties. You can't prove. I have the ledgers. Sebastian gestured to Elspeth. Your wife kept excellent records. Every debt, every illegal transaction, every piece of entailed property you sold. 3 years of meticulous documentation that will hold up in any court. Thomas's gaze swung to Elspeth, shock and fury warring on his face. You've been keeping records. Behind my back. Elspeth straightened, finding courage in Sebastian's presence. Someone had to. You were destroying everything my family built, everything that was supposed to pass to our children. I couldn't let you do it without witness. She'd started the ledger in her first month of marriage, when she'd realized Thomas's business dealings were actually desperate gambling. Had recorded every visit from creditors, every piece of furniture sold, every acre illegally mortgaged. Not out of any hope of using it under coverture law, she had no legal standing to challenge her husband, but because she couldn't bear to watch her inheritance disappear without some form of protest. Now, watching Thomas's face, Elspeth realized her silent rebellion had become her salvation. Where are they? Thomas demanded. The ledgers. Give them to me now. They're safe, Sebastian said. Already in the hands of my solicitors in London. Along with statements from servants, creditors, and several gentlemen who witnessed your discipline of your wife in public venues. Thomas's expression shifted through several emotions, rage, fear, calculation. Finally settling on something that made Elspeth's skin crawl. Fine. He straightened his coat with shaking hands. You've made your point, Aristhope. I'll modify my behavior. Treat Elspeth with more consideration. But she's still my wife, and this is still my home. You have no legal right to interfere. Actually, Sebastian said quietly, I do. He pulled another document from his coat, this one larger, sealed with red wax that bore the royal crest. I've purchased every debt you owe. Every marker, every mortgage, every illegal claim on entailed property. As of this morning, Thomas Blackwood, you owe me approximately £35,000. The number hung in the air like cannon fire. Elspeth gasped. She'd known Thomas's debts were extensive, but £35,000 was a fortune. You're lying, Thomas said, but his voice cracked. I don't lie. Sebastian's tone was arctic. I've spent 3 years acquiring your debts from every gambling hell, moneylender, and desperate creditor in England. You have 1 month to produce payment in full. When you fail, as we both know you will, this estate and everything in it becomes mine. Understanding dawned on Thomas's face, followed by pure hatred. You planned this. Deliberately bankrupted me. You bankrupted yourself. Sebastian's voice was implacable. I merely ensured that when you fell, it would be into my hands rather than some stranger's. Because unlike a stranger, I have a vested interest in protecting what's mine. His eyes found Elspeth's across the room, and the possessiveness in his gaze made her breath catch. She was promised to me once, Sebastian continued, still looking at Elspeth. Before debts and desperation intervened. The stars know you were meant to be mine, Elspeth. And I have spent 3 years, 1,000 nights, buying back what should never have been taken. The words echoed something Elspeth had whispered to herself in her darkest moments. That she'd been meant for Sebastian, that their engagement had been right in ways her marriage to Thomas never was. Get out, Thomas said, his voice shaking. Both of you, get out of my sight. Gladly. Sebastian offered his arm to Elspeth. Mrs. Blackwood, would you do me the honor of showing me the gardens? I believe we have much to discuss. Elspeth hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his arm. The contact was shocking. She couldn't remember the last time she'd touched someone without flinching in anticipation of pain. They left Thomas standing in the library, fury and defeat written across his face in equal measure. 3. The rain had stopped, leaving the gardens of Blackwood Hall glistening in moonlight. Elspeth walked beside Sebastian along paths she'd once loved, her hand still resting on his arm, hyper-aware of every point of contact. In 1775 England, this was scandalous, a married woman walking alone with a man who wasn't her husband, touching him without gloves, without chaperone. But Elspeth had learned that scandal was relative. 3 years of abuse had taught her that proper behavior and social reputation meant nothing when you were dying inside. Tell me everything, Sebastian said quietly as they walked. Not the facts in the ledger, not the evidence I've collected. Tell me what it's been like. Really. Elspeth didn't want to. Wanted to preserve some dignity, some pride. But Sebastian's presence had cracked something open inside her, and the words spilled out like poison from a wound. She told him about the first time Thomas had hit her, 2 weeks after their wedding, when she'd questioned his decision to sell her mother's jewelry. About the escalating violence, the isolation as Thomas drove away any servants who might be loyal to her. About the coverture laws that made her nothing, erased her legal existence so completely that she couldn't own property, couldn't enter contracts, couldn't even report her own husband's crimes. I kept the ledger, she said, because it was the only rebellion I had left. The only way to prove I still existed, that I was still Elspeth Thorne inside even if the law said I was only Mrs. Thomas Blackwood. Sebastian stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The moonlight caught his face, highlighting the fury and grief written there. I should have fought harder, he said, his voice rough. When your father came to me, desperate for money to pay his debts, I should have given it to him freely instead of insisting it had to be a loan. Should have anticipated that he'd turn to Blackwood when I couldn't provide funds fast enough. You couldn't have known. I knew Blackwood's reputation. Sebastian's hands came up to frame her face with devastating gentleness. Knew he was unstable, violent, that his first wife had died under suspicious circumstances. But I was proud, Elspeth. Wanted your father to see me as a peer, not a benefactor. That pride cost you 3 years of hell. Elspeth felt tears streaming down her face, 3 years' worth of grief and pain she'd held inside finally breaking free. Don't, she whispered. Don't blame yourself for what Thomas chose to do. Then don't blame yourself either. Sebastian's thumb brushed away her tears. I've seen your ledger, Elspeth. Read every entry. You think you were just documenting crimes, but what I saw was a woman refusing to disappear. refusing to let him erase you completely. That's not just rebellion. That's courage. I didn't feel courageous. I felt trapped. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing to fight even when you're terrified. Sebastian's hand slid down to her wrists, and he pushed up her sleeves carefully, revealing the full extent of her bruises. The law says you belong to him. But the stars know you were promised to me. And I will not let him touch you again. How? Elspeth heard the desperation in her own voice. The coverture laws are about to change. Sebastian's smile was grim. I've been working with reformers in Parliament. We're building a case for legal separation in cases of extreme cruelty. Your ledger, combined with witness testimony, will establish precedent. But that takes time, and you don't have time. Then what? You leave. Tonight. With me. Sebastian took both her hands, and the contact sent electricity through Elspeth's entire body. I have a house in Bath. Small, private, with staff I trust absolutely. You'll be safe there while my solicitors work on the legal separation. People will talk. The scandal. Let them talk. Sebastian's voice was fierce. I've spent 3 years being respectable while you suffered. 3 years following society's rules while you were beaten and broken. I'm done with respectability, Elspeth. Done with propriety that protects men like Thomas and destroys women like you. His fingers traced the bruises on her wrists with exquisite care, his touch so gentle it made Elspeth want to weep. In the 1770s, he said quietly, a duke touching a lady's bare wrist is scandalous. But I'm past caring about scandal. He raised her wrist to his lips, pressing a kiss to the worst of the bruises. You were meant to be mine, Elspeth. 3 years ago, 3 years from now, 300 years from now. And I have spent 1,000 nights buying back what never should have been taken. Sebastian, his name came out broken, desperate. Come with me. His grey eyes held hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Not as my mistress, not as some shameful secret. Come with me as the woman I should have married, the woman I still intend to marry once the law allows it. Come with me and let me spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice. Elspeth looked back at Blackwood Hall, at the cold stone prison where she'd slowly died over 3 years. Looked at the man before her, who'd spent those same 3 years methodically dismantling her husband's life to save hers. The choice should have been impossible. Society would crucify her for leaving her husband. The church would condemn her. Every woman who valued respectability would turn their backs. But Elspeth had learned something in 3 years of abuse. Respectability meant nothing if you were dead inside. Yes, she whispered. Take me away from here. Sebastian's expression transformed relief and joy and fierce possessiveness all at once. He pulled her into his arms, and Elspeth buried her face in his velvet coat, breathing in sandalwood and safety. Pack nothing, he murmured against her hair. Leave it all behind. I'll give you everything, new clothes, jewelry, whatever you need. But I want nothing of his touching you ever again. I have one thing I must take. Elspeth pulled back to meet his eyes. My mother's locket. Thomas didn't sell it because it has no gems, just a miniature. But it's all I have left of her. Then we'll get it. Sebastian's hand slid to the small of her back, warm and possessive. And then we leave this place forever. They returned to the house, Sebastian's presence transforming the oppressive halls into something almost bearable. Elspeth retrieved the locket from its hiding place in her bedroom, tucked inside a false panel she'd discovered years ago, the only thing Thomas hadn't found and sold. When she emerged, locket clutched in her hand, Sebastian was waiting. His carriage stood ready in the drive, his driver already mounted. Your Grace. Hobbs appeared, clearly distressed. You can't just take the mistress. Mr. Blackwood will have the law on you. Let him try. Sebastian handed Elspeth into the carriage with exquisite courtesy. Tell your master that his wife has left him. Tell him she's under my protection now. And tell him that if he attempts to follow or reclaim her, I will unleash every piece of evidence I have and destroy him completely. He climbed in beside Elspeth, settling close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Drive," he called to his man. "Don't stop until we reach Bath." As the carriage pulled away, Elspeth looked back one last time at Blackwood Hall. 3 years of her life. 1,000 nights of suffering. But she was leaving. Finally, impossibly, leaving. She turned back to find Sebastian watching her, concern in his grey eyes. "Regrets?" he asked softly. "None." Elspeth meant it. "Only wonder at how this is real." Sebastian took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "It's real. You're free. And I swear to you, Elspeth, I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never feel trapped again." The carriage rolled on through the night, carrying Elspeth away from hell and towards something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope. 4. The house in Bath was everything Blackwood Hall wasn't. Warm. Light. Filled with books and comfortable furniture and servants who smiled when they worked. Sebastian's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, took one look at Elspeth's bruised wrists and tear-stained face and immediately began arranging a warm bath and fresh clothes. "Poor lamb," she murmured, her accent carrying notes of her Chinese heritage. "Don't you worry now. His Grace, he takes good care of his people." The bath was heaven. Hot water, scented with lavender, in a copper tub that was clearly expensive and well-maintained. Elspeth soaked until her skin pruned, washing away 3 years of Blackwood Hall and Thomas's violence. When she emerged, Mrs. Chen had laid out a dress on the bed. Not the threadbare rags Elspeth had worn at the manor, but beautiful blue muslin, simply cut but clearly quality. It fit perfectly, as though Sebastian had somehow known her measurements. "His Grace, he had this made weeks ago," Mrs. Chen explained, helping Elspeth with the buttons. "Been planning your arrival, he has. Wanted everything ready." Elspeth felt tears prick her eyes again. Sebastian had been planning this for weeks. While she'd been trapped in that cold manor, he'd been here, preparing a sanctuary. She found him in the library, staring out the window at Bath's gaslit streets. He'd changed from his formal coat into something simpler, shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his hair unpowdered and falling loose around his face. He looked younger this way. Less like a duke and more like the man she'd known before debts and duty had separated them. "Sebastian." He turned at her voice, and his expression did something complicated when he saw her. Relief, hunger, protectiveness all warring for dominance. "The dress fits," he said, his voice rough. "Mrs. Chen said you had it made weeks ago. I've had this house ready for months." Sebastian crossed to her, stopping just close enough that she could feel his warmth. "From the moment I realized what Thomas was doing to you, I've been preparing for this. Buying his debts, yes, but also creating a place where you'd be safe. Where you could heal." Why? Elspeth needed to understand. Why spend 3 years, all this money, this effort? You're not just anything. Sebastian's hand came up to cup her cheek. "You're Elspeth Thorne. The woman who was promised to me. The woman I should have married if I hadn't been too proud to give your father the money as a gift instead of a loan. You've mentioned that twice now. The loan. Because it haunts me." Sebastian's thumb traced her cheekbone. "Your father came to me desperate. Needed £10,000 immediately to cover gambling debts. I offered it as a loan, with generous terms, because I didn't want him to feel like charity. But the moneylenders wouldn't wait for him to negotiate loan terms. So he went to Thomas Blackwood, who offered cash immediately in exchange for your hand. Understanding dawned. You lost me because you were trying to preserve my father's dignity. I lost you because I was a fool." Sebastian's voice cracked. "And you've paid the price for my foolishness for 3 years." Elspeth took his hand, the one that was touching her face, and pressed it more firmly against her cheek. "Then we've both been fools. I should have fought harder against my father's decision. Should have run away, created a scandal, something. The coverture laws. I know." Elspeth's voice turned bitter. "Once I married Thomas, I ceased to exist legally. Became his property to do with as he pleased. Even my body wasn't my own." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sebastian's expression darkened. Did he couldn't seem to finish the question. Not in the way you're thinking. Elspeth needed him to understand, even though it was humiliating to admit. Thomas had no interest in me that way. His brutality was purely violence, not that. Small mercy, I suppose. There's no mercy in what he did to you. Sebastian pulled her closer, his arms coming around her waist. Elspeth, I need you to understand something. You're safe here. Completely safe. I will never hurt you. Never touch you without permission. Never use the power I have over you in any way that makes you feel trapped. You don't have power over me. I'm a duke. You're a woman who just fled her husband. Society will assume I'm keeping you as my mistress, that you're dependent on my generosity. Sebastian's hands spread across her back, warm and steady. But I want you to know that's not true. The account I've set up in your name is yours absolutely. If you want to leave, if this becomes another prison, you can. You'll have the resources to go anywhere, do anything. Elspeth stared up at him, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. You're giving me freedom. I'm giving you what you should always have had. Agency. Choice. The ability to determine your own future. His forehead rested against hers. I love you, Elspeth. I've loved you since before your father's debts destroyed everything. But I won't trap you in that love. Won't make you feel like you owe me anything because I helped you escape. Sebastian. Let me finish. His voice was urgent. My solicitors are working on the legal separation. It will take time, possibly years. The coverture laws are deeply entrenched, and proving extreme cruelty is difficult even with your ledger. But eventually, you'll be free. Legally, permanently free. And then, he took a shaking breath. Then I'll ask you properly. Not when you're desperate and I'm your only option. But when you're healed and whole and capable of choosing me because you want to, not because you need to. Elspeth felt something break open in her chest, some last wall of defense crumbling. This man, this duke who could have anyone, was offering her the most precious gift imaginable. Time. Space. Freedom to heal. You're remarkable, she whispered. I'm selfish. Sebastian's smile was self-deprecating. I want you, Elspeth. Want you so badly it terrifies me. But I want you whole. Want you to choose me with clear eyes and a healed heart, not desperation and gratitude. Elspeth reached up, threading her fingers through his loose hair. What if I'm already choosing you? Then I'll remind you every day that you can change your mind. But his arms tightened around her. That you're not trapped. That this house, this life, everything I'm offering, it's yours regardless of whether you love me back. I do love you back. The words came out fierce, certain. I loved you 3 years ago. Loved you through every day of my marriage to Thomas. Loved you enough that I kept myself alive for 1,000 nights because somewhere deep down, I believed you'd come for me. Sebastian's expression transformed. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent and full of 3 years of longing. Elspeth melted into it, into him, feeling safe for the first time in forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian kept her close. Stay with me, he murmured against her hair. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because I've orchestrated your escape. Stay with me because you want to. Because this is where you choose to be. I choose this, Elspeth said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. I choose you. They stood like that in the Bath townhouse library, 2 people who'd been separated by debt and duty and coverture laws, finally together. And for the first time in 3 years, Elspeth believed in happy endings. 5. The scandal, when it broke across London society, was magnificent. The Duke of Aristhope harbouring a married woman in his Bath residence. Mrs. Thomas Blackwood abandoning her husband, her vows, her very respectability. Society didn't know whether to be horrified or fascinated. Most settled on both. Letters arrived daily at the Bath townhouse, some offering support, most condemning. The church sent representatives to urge Elspeth to return to her husband. Thomas himself sent increasingly desperate demands, threats, pleas. Sebastian had them all burned unread. Your past is gone, he told Elspeth firmly. You don't owe Thomas explanations. You don't owe society justifications. You survived, and now you get to live. Living turned out to be complicated. Elspeth had nightmares most nights, waking in a cold sweat, expecting Thomas's fists. Sebastian would hear her from his adjoining room and appear in her doorway, staying until she fell back asleep. Never pushing, never demanding, just present. She flinched at sudden movements for weeks. Couldn't bear to be in cold rooms. Had moments where the weight of 3 years would crash over her and she'd break down sobbing. Through it all, Sebastian remained steady. Patient. Present without being suffocating. Healing isn't linear, he said one afternoon when Elspeth apologized for crying over nothing. You survived hell, Elspeth. Give yourself time to come back from it. The legal proceedings moved slowly. Sebastian's solicitors filed for judicial separation on grounds of extreme cruelty, supported by Elspeth's ledger and testimony from servants who'd witnessed Thomas's violence. Thomas fought back, of course. Hired his own solicitors to argue that he'd never struck his wife, that any bruises were self-inflicted, that Elspeth was hysterical and prone to dramatic accusations. But then Sebastian produced something that changed everything. A letter. Written by Thomas's first wife, hidden in Blackwood Hall and discovered during Sebastian's purchase of the property. A letter describing systematic abuse, detailing injuries, begging her family for help that never came. She'd died 3 months after writing it. Officially from a fall down the stairs. But the letter suggested something far darker. The case shifted dramatically after that. Thomas's claims of innocence looked hollow next to 2 wives with nearly identical stories. The courts, while still reluctant to interfere in marital relations, couldn't ignore evidence of repeated patterns of violence. The judicial separation was granted in April 1776, nearly 6 months after Elspeth had fled Blackwood Hall. She woke that morning in the Bath townhouse to find Sebastian standing in her doorway, holding the legal decree with tears streaming down his face. You're free, he said, his voice breaking. Legally, completely free. Elspeth took the document with shaking hands, reading the formal language that severed her legal connection to Thomas Blackwood. She was no longer his wife, no longer his property. The coverture that had erased her identity was lifted. She was Elspeth Thorne again. What happens now? She asked, looking up at Sebastian. He crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair. Now I ask you properly. Not when you're desperate, not when I'm your only option, but when you're free to choose. He pulled a ring from his pocket, sapphires and diamonds, beautiful but not ostentatious. Elspeth Thorne, will you marry me? Not because of debts or duty or desperation. Marry me because you want to. Because you choose this life with me. Because you love me the way I love you, completely, irrevocably, with everything I am. Elspeth looked at this man who'd spent 3 years systematically dismantling her husband's life to save hers. Who'd given her sanctuary, time to heal, freedom to choose her own future. Who'd loved her with patience and steadiness through nightmares and tears and moments when she'd been sure she'd never be whole again. Yes, she said, no hesitation. 1,000 times yes. They were married quietly in Bath 3 months later, with only Mrs. Chen and Sebastian's closest friends in attendance. No grand society wedding, no elaborate ceremony. Just 2 people promising to love and honor each other, to build a life based on choice rather than obligation. The scandal continued, of course. London society never quite forgave the Duke of Aristhope for choosing a divorced woman. Invitations dried up, old friends turned their backs. Sebastian didn't care. I spent 3 years following society's rules while you suffered, he told Elspeth on their wedding night. I'm done with a world that values respectability over kindness, reputation over justice. If they can't accept you, they don't deserve me. They split their time between Bath and Sebastian's estates in the north, far from London's judging eyes. Sebastian continued his work in Parliament, now focusing specifically on coverture law reform. He used Elspeth's ledger, the letters from Thomas's first wife, their own story as ammunition to push for legal protections for married women. It would take decades for meaningful reform to pass. But they'd started something. Proved that women could survive abuse, could escape, could find happiness despite society's condemnation. And Elspeth, who'd spent 3 years as invisible property, became an advocate for other trapped women. She opened her home to those fleeing violence, used her position as a duchess to pressure courts to grant separations, and testified before Parliament about the realities of coverture. "You were meant for this," Sebastian said one evening, watching her draft another speech. "Not just to survive, but to change the world that tried to destroy you." 5 years after Elspeth had fled Blackwood Hall, they stood together in Parliament as new legislation passed, limited, insufficient, but a start. Legal recognition that wives were separate people from their husbands. Small protections for women facing extreme cruelty. It wasn't enough. Wouldn't help everyone. But it was more than had existed before. "We did this," Elspeth whispered, watching Lords vote on measures she'd helped draft. "You did this." Sebastian took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You survived. And then you made sure other women could survive too." That night, back in their Bath townhouse, Elspeth stood in the same library where Sebastian had first offered her freedom. She thought about the woman she'd been, bruised, broken, burning silk with blooded fingers. And she thought about who she'd become. A survivor, an advocate, a duchess who'd learned that scandal was meaningless compared to safety. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Sebastian, who was reading by the fire. "The scandal, the lost friendships, everything you gave up to save me." Sebastian set down his book, pulling her into his lap. "I gave up nothing. I gained everything." He kissed her, warm and sure, and Elspeth felt the truth of it settle into her bones. 3 years of beatings and abuse had nearly destroyed her. But a duke had walked through her door, had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, had given her not just rescue but the tools to save herself. And together, they'd changed history. Not just their own story, but the beginning of a movement. The start of recognition that women were people, not property. That coverture laws needed reform. That abuse should never be hidden behind respectable doors. It would take generations to finish what they'd started.